Okay, we just observed Isaac use the 10 frames in a few simple counting activities. And so what we saw Isaac do was very important. We saw a lot of developmental milestones. We see a lot of strengths in his counting, as well as some areas that he needs to work on. One of his great strengths was a stable principle of counting. He understands that the numbers have an order. He uses it consistently. He has a good grasp of one-to-one correspondence, although he did have to go back and self-correct. So a growth point for him is that he needs to continue that practice for accuracy and fluency. He's pretty accurate.
And by the one-to-one correspondence, you mean every time he says a number, he points to one object. So it's 1,
Exactly.
2, 3, 4. Where at one point, I think he missed one of the counting, right? He said
Exactly.
1, 2, 3, 4. At one point he missed it slightly, but then he went back and caught
Right,
himself.
and the good point was that he was able to self-correct, but he understands the one-to-one correspondence principle, which is when you're counting objects in a set, you count it only one time. For younger learners, you touch it just once, and then you move on and you continue with the number order. So he has a good grasp of that. It's not as automatic as it will be with additional practice. So he had the stable counting principle. He used the number orders. He understood one-to-one correspondence and was able to self-correct. He understood cardinality, which was, cardinality is the understanding that the last number you name in a set is the amount in the set. So he had a very good understanding of that, because when we asked him, so now how many are there, he knew to name the last number that he named. So also he began to subbatize, which is another very simple counting principle, which means I can look at an amount, for example, these here that are turned over on the yellow side, these counters. I can look at that and say 3 without having to count. Isaac was able to do that with very small numbers, the 3 and the 2. With the larger numbers, when I said how many, he went back to the security of counting, which is a very normal process for young learners. The advantage of using counters and manipulatives is that it gives them a visual of amounts, so they can practice and begin to visually internalize those quantities. And so, for example, with the larger numbers, when it was 9 and 10, he was not comfortable to subbatize, even pointing out how many rows do we have here. He still wanted to count to make sure.
Okay, so subbatizing was the idea that if you have a set, you can look at that set and know how many are in the set without having to count
Without
them.
counting,
Okay,
that's
so
the
like
key.
I know that these are 3 counters, I don't have to count them. I
Right.
just see that as a set of 3. I guess a real life example would be like a dozen eggs. I see
Exactly.
a dozen eggs as 1 dozen rather
Right.
than 12 individual eggs. Okay.
Mhm. And also, even before you use number words, well, another way of subbatizing is to know that this set has more and this has less. And so young children will do that even before number words and vocabulary come into play. They'll be able to look at a group of items and they'll call it more or less, or they'll say bigger and smaller. Usually more and less are the terms that are most common first, and then bigger and smaller.
So when you were asking Isaac about the rows, when you were saying that this is 1 row, you were prompting him to subbatize to see this
Exactly.
5 as a set of 5 or 1 row rather than 5 individuals.
Exactly. And again, just at the very beginning stages of it, he did need more than one verbal prompting cue, which is very normal, but an important part of the learning process for children this young is to give those verbal cues and point out that relationship. Sometimes students will recognize it later on, but it's a lot easier with guided instruction or the opportunity to explore with manipulatives.
Right. He picked up pretty quickly on the idea that if you fill in the whole 10 frame, that is 10. He picked up on that pretty quickly.
And that's the benefit of the 10 frame, because if you notice with the smaller amounts, he did subbatize. But with the 10 frame, then he was able to say, wait a minute, we don't need 1. And it was good to see that he figured that out before he used the frame. So at that point, he was beginning to make that association and mentally subbatize the amount of 10.
And later that'll lead into subtraction, where if you have 10 and you take away 1, that's 9. That'll make subtraction so much easier for him
And
later
so
on.
when he's working with single digit addition and subtraction, he'll recognize those patterns. And so that will create fluency with those smaller numbers. That fluency with those smaller numbers can transition into fluency with larger numbers. Those are your students who can look at double and triple digit numbers and be able to add and subtract them quickly because they remember the number pattern and the number framework of the digits from 0 to 9.
Right. The 10 frame always reminds me of another vocabulary word that we use, which is part whole.
Yes.
Part whole is the idea that any number can be broken down into smaller parts. So for example, I have the number 7 here. Well, the 10 frame helps us see that the number 7, you have 5 and 2 more. So this is part and part, and then the whole is the 7. So I think the 10 frame is really nice for that.
Very useful for that. And during the observation with Isaac, I had asked him, now how many frames do you need to make that number? So again, that's a very beginning step to get him to recognize and verbalize those relationships.
And this will lead into two-digit numbers also.
Very easily, yes.
Yes, once children are comfortable with the idea that if you have a complete 10 frame, once they're comfortable with the idea that this is 10, then we can talk about 12 as being 10 and then 2 more. Or 14 is 10 and 4 more. So it leads into place value.
Oh, it does, definitely. In fact, you'll see frames, some of them go as far as having 20. You'll see some frames actually have 4 rows. But for younger learners, you start with the 1, and then you graduate to 2. And it's okay to stay there for a while and really let them get fluent with the 10 frames, and then go ahead and add additional rows.
I was glad to see that he liked these activities. When you asked if he wanted to keep going, he wanted to keep going. So
Exactly.
I was happy to see that he liked the activities.
Me too.